Now moving to test for independence. This is our two-way chi-square. Chi-square can also be used to test the relationship between two variables. For example, a group of students can be categorized in terms of personality, whether they're introverted versus extroverted, and in terms of color preference between red, green, yellow, or blue. Notice that this table here is it's setting up the information of our variables in a way that's trying to indicate to us that we are looking for, is there an association between these two variables? And so this is how you would set it up by hand. And so this is letting us know that there are 10 introverts who preferred red, 3 introverts who preferred yellow. There are 25 extroverts who preferred green. So that's how you would read this. These numbers that you see on the end, I apologize that the language isn't in here, but these would effectively read total. And so the total number of introverts that we have is 50. And this is calculated by adding up all the introverts that we have in this sample. And then we have 150 extroverts. And that's as a result of adding up the number of extroverts in this sample. So that would be the total for introverts versus the total for extroverts. And those would represent our row marginal totals. All right, so that is for our rows. Then if we were looking down the columns, again, you would have the language of total written here. We have a total of 100 individuals who preferred red. We have a total of 20 individuals who preferred yellow, 40 preferred green, and 40 preferred blue. And so these would now represent our column marginal totals for our analysis. This number here, the 200, represents our n. This is the total number of individuals in this sample. This is determined by adding up either all of your row marginal totals or adding up your column marginal totals. 50 plus 150 is 200. The reason that you would add up either the row marginal totals or the column marginal totals is because adding up each of those numbers, row marginal totals and column marginal totals, should equal the same number because it represents how many people are in your sample overall. And so if we add 100 to 20 to 40 plus 40, it would equal 200. In order to calculate the two-way chi-square by hand, we would need to determine the difference between expected and observed frequencies by calculating the expected frequencies. We would consider the following example on the next slide. I'm going to show you what it means to kind of use each of the row and column marginal totals to calculate your expected frequency. It uses the same chi-square formula, but the degrees of freedom are slightly different, such that we would actually take R as the number of rows that we have in our data, minus 1, multiplied by C, which is the number of columns of data, minus 1. And we would multiply those numbers together. So this table or this illustration here is identifying the different components that we would use to calculate the expected frequency to go about hand calculating our two-way chi-square. So notice that we have observed frequency in each of these cells. This is effectively saying, all right, we ask people, what is your political orientation? Are you liberal? Are you conservative? And we ask those same people, what is your method of child rearing? Is it permissive or non-permissive? So in order to read this with regard to its observed frequencies and what we collected in our data, we had 15 people who identified themselves as liberal and identified their method of child rearing as permissive. We had 5 people who identified themselves as liberal and non-permissive parenting. We had 10 people who identified themselves as conservative with permissive parenting, and 10 people who identified themselves as non-permissive, conservative with non-permissive parenting. So these numbers outside the parentheses indicate our observed frequencies. Within the parentheses, we have expected frequencies. Remember that in order to calculate expected frequencies for the two-way chi-square, you would take the row marginal total. If we're looking at these individuals who are liberal with permissive parenting, that cell, we would take that cell's row marginal total. So the row marginal total associated with this cell, this box, is 25, multiplied by the column marginal total associated with that cell, which is 20. When you multiply those together, whatever that product is, you divide by your n of 40. I'm showing you how this process works, but again, not asking you to do this by hand. And we would do this separately for each different cell that we have. Remember that in order to calculate degrees of freedom, we would take our number of rows. We have a total of 2 rows here with -1 multiplied by our number of columns. We have 2 columns here, -1. Okay, so test for independence. This is our two-way chi-square. How do you write the null and research hypotheses and concluding statements? So this one works slightly differently than the goodness of fit test. For your null hypothesis, you would state that there is no association between the two categorical variables because we're looking for a relationship, right? We're looking to see if there's a relationship between, in the previous example, between your political party affiliation and your method of child rearing. Alternatively, your research hypothesis would indicate that there is an association between the two categorical variables. And finally, your concluding statement would be there is or is not an association between the two categorical variables. Therefore, we retain or reject the null hypothesis. This is another example of the output for a test for independence that I'll show you again when learning how to do this in SPSS. So this particular research question was asking, is there an association between someone's status as a veteran and their identity, their sex identity? So we had to have people who answer both the question, are you a veteran? Yes or no. What is your sex, male or female? Within the output, we see that this count actually takes the place of the language of observed. And so we had, according to this particular test, we had 60 males who are veterans. We had 13 females who are veterans. For the males, we expected to see 31.2, but we actually saw 60, which means there were more males than expected. We also expected to see 51 females who are veterans, but we only had 13, so there were fewer observed female veterans than expected. For males who were not veterans, we had 392 as part of this sample, but we expected 420.8, so we did have fewer males who were not veterans. And similarly, we observed 592 females who were not veterans. However, we expected to see 563, so we had more females who were not veterans than expected. So this is indicating all of the observed and expected frequencies for your test. With this chi-square test table, I know that there's a lot of information here. However, the only thing you need to pay attention to in order to determine if there is significance in your test is this first row where it says Pearson's chi-square. Our chi-square statistic for this analysis is 49.808. We have a degrees of freedom of 1. We have an asymptotic significance of less than 0.001. So we're comparing this to 0.05. It is less than 0.05, which means we do have significance. In order to report these results, we would state a chi-square test of independence was conducted to examine the relationship between veteran status and sex. The relationship between these variables was statistically significant. Notice that this test results here, the chi-square 1, n equals whatever your n is, your chi-square, your p-value. It follows the same formatting as your goodness of fit test. And so I left the, call it a formula, if you will, for where each of these pieces of information is coming from. Among veterans, there were significantly more males, 60, n equals 60, than would be expected by chance, and expected equals 31.2. So we're drawing those pieces of information from our table. And fewer females with an n of 13 than would be expected by chance. Expected count equals 41.8. Among non-veterans, there were fewer males, n equals 392 than would be expected by chance. Expected count 420.8. And more females, n equals 592. Than would be expected by chance with expected count 563.2. These results suggest that veteran status and sex are not independent, with males being overrepresented among veterans in this sample. Similarly, you could also identify with females being underrepresented among veterans in this sample. You could also say with males being underrepresented among non-veterans in this sample, or with females being overrepresented among non-veterans in this sample. I wouldn't expect you to make all 4 connections as long as you have at least one. So that's all I've got for this test. Remember that this is chi-square. It's a non-parametric test. It actually involves two separate analyses. There is the one-way or goodness of fit test and the two-way or test for independence. Please be on the lookout for the following video where I show you how to conduct each of these tests within SPSS.